between his thoughts and his impulses, between his reason and his intuition. This inconsistency gradually develops more and more intellectual validity. We are able to see every day proof of the tyranny of circumstances over persons. Yet we are rather reluctant to accept this proof. We question it. We want to doubt it. We want to try, if possible, to continue to hold the child dream, or preserve what the Chinese philosopher Mencius called the child heart. The child heart we have discovered in our daily living to be a tremendous source of strength, whereas this intellectual doubt that rises within us is not a source of strength. It is a source of division. It is a source of weakness. It takes from us the power of personal incentive. It makes us weary, fatigues us, and by disillusionment deprives us of our vitality. We therefore observe that idealism is vital, dynamic, whereas what we term realism is not vital, and it is static. It weakens and does not strengthen. It impoverishes and does not enrich. So we are struggling in ourselves against what appears to be the fact of materialism and the illusion of ideality. Yet man, because actually his various springboards, his motivations do come essentially from inside, refuses to completely give up or completely deny that which inwardly he knows to be necessary and good. Perhaps this is the reason why all great cycles of materialism, as recorded in history, have ended in the restoration of idealism. There is something stronger than the reasoning faculties, and this something is man's intuitive perception of good, his unwillingness to reject a beautiful reality as he knows it inwardly to be, for a less beautiful and less inspiring factuality as he sees around him in life. Thus we see the gradual shift. Intellectually, man is prepared to cope with tragedy. Internally, emotionally, he prefers to function on the level of romantic story. As a result, however, of the rise of a powerful intellectualism, which now more or less dominates social motion, we have the so-called philosophy of disillusionment. This philosophy is intellectually sustainable. Yet even as we sustain it, it injures us. Even as we affirm it, we prove ourselves to be impoverished by it. Consequently, it cannot become the dominant reality for us. If, therefore, we look around us in art, in music, and in all the various cultures that we now maintain, and we observe this gradual drifting towards intellectual materialism, we see it with misgiving. We do not joyously go forth to meet it. And each generation, watching the future, becomes a little anxious, a little disturbed by this drift away from value, because upon our idealism is suspended, or from it is suspended, our entire ethical and cultural life. If our idealism should be actually undermined, should be positively disturbed, then nearly everything that is important to us, it will be adversely affected. Considering the materialistic or realistic approach, observing its works, and particularly noting its lack of perspective into the future, we have become anxious lest something of this nature take over, depriving us of much and giving us little, taking much more than it can give, because it has so little to offer above the level of creature comfort, which the individual has long recognized to be insufficient. Thus, the story of our folklore and legendary reveals our firm foundation upon idealism, and that this idealism is still so strong in us as a group, as a collective body, that we still rejoice in this type of literature, select it, perpetuate it, and still regard it as a rich heritage, and continually attempt to use it in the education and unfoldment of the child mind of the generation. The children naturally are inclined to this type of romantic literature, has also been observed, and that it is the conflict between this romantic literature and so-called factuality that has led the modern psychologist to recommend that children no longer be given this material. It is simply because the ideal brings them into such violent conflict with the factual. The psychologist, the educator, the minister, these individuals do not say that these stories are wrong. They do not say that the moral of the fairy tale is bad. They tell us, however, that the effect of an idealistic literature upon the minds of individuals who are not going to live in that kind of a world may prove to be dangerous. Now, why do we not live in the kind of a world in which idealism can have some fair and proper degree of expression? That is a large question. But man is concerned today more with adjusting with circumstances than he is altering the shape of circumstances. Rather than to attempt through a united effort to build something of a more positive nature, he is content to continue this program of compromise with negation. What perhaps neither the psychologist nor the educator realizes is the tremendous availability of idealism if it was cultivated, directed, made available to the average life of the person. If he had any opportunity, any chance, any means, the average person would shift his foundations onto an ideological basis. It is that he is afraid to do so, or has been educated out of the desirability of doing so. Out of the 2.5 billion human beings that now populate this earth, actually it is doubtful if 1% is devoutly materialistic. Many have had materialism forced upon them by systems. And I think a good example of that would be your so-called Iron Curtain countries. Behind the Iron Curtain, we do not have a solid materialism. We have a materialistic indoctrination attempting to force itself upon masses of people. But left to their own devices, even today, 95% of those persons would return to an idealistic way of life. It is not their desire. It is a pressure which individually they have no means of withstanding. Now, on this side of the Iron Curtain, the situation is the same. Instead of having a strong political pressure working upon us, we have a strong psychological economic pressure working upon us. This pressure is forcing us also to attitudes and codes and ways of conduct which do not please us. And a great deal of our psychological disturbance is due to the fact that we are continually required to do things we do not believe and to live according to standards that are not satisfactory to ourselves. The individual who is no longer able to respect his own conduct has weakened himself tremendously. So on this foundation, the fairy story becomes a tremendous psychological document. And we can break most of these stories down into two general patterns. These patterns represent the anima story, of which Cinderella is one of the most outstanding examples, and the animus story, which perhaps is best exemplified for the story of Jack and the Beanstalk. These two stories represent the psychological polarities of a situation that we all recognize and all face. We know that within the human being there is a psychic integration. And one school of psychological research has termed this psychic integration the anima-animus focus. The anima focus is the psychic feminine focus. The animus, the psychic male focus. These two psychic foci within our consciousness are responsible for a very large part of our psychological literature, of which there is nothing more obvious than the fairy story, which becomes almost, if not completely, a dream story. Actually, if a person dreamed the Cinderella story, either as a participant or as an observer, we could psychologically interpret that person almost immediately. We would know exactly the kind of problem that besets him. We know the kind of situation that has arisen in the life of that person. The mere fact that this story is not necessarily an individual account, but is a collective which has arisen in the body of society and which continues to influence very strongly, does not change the interpretation. It merely makes the interpretation collective rather than individual. If the collective had rejected the story, had considered this story no longer of interest, had failed to perpetuate it, had not clothed it in 1,000 versions and preserved it through 5,000 years of history, we might say that it is all incidental. But the folk consciousness of the race is merely a collective, personal, psychic entity. And what it preserves, and what it accepts, and what it rejects, these tell the story of itself and cannot be denied by any thoughtful, observing person. In these stories, then, we have simplified versions of the age of chivalry. We have, again, legends derived from the cycle of Charlemagne and Roland. We have the Indian fables. We have the Persian legendary and lore, and the old Chinese accounts, as they are preserved to us in the Red Chamber collection and other ancient sources. In Arabia, of course, the Arabian Nights Entertainment conveys the same essential pattern. Now, in almost all fairy stories, it is necessary for one element to appear, an element without which most of the things that seem desirable to us are unobtainable, and that is magic. A fairy story must nearly always involve some form of supernatural agency, a supernatural intervention. It may frequently involve a polarized supernatural agency, one seeking for good and one attempting to advance evil.